Hey everybody! So this video is going to cover what you need to know for the factorial designs assignment, or assignment 6. So basically everything that we've covered so far, and the way people usually think about the relationships between variables are typically involving one independent variable at a time. So usually people think about, well, what's the effect of social support on depression? And usually, the person who's a novice to science, the person who's not a scientist, so who's just you're chatting with on a daily basis, we tend to think in terms of single variables. But with behavior is what we call multiply determined, meaning no one variable determines behavior. All right, no one thing works in isolation by itself to predict behavior. So, for the most part, the vast majority of research does not deal in terms of single variables. It doesn't deal in terms of the differences between two conditions on a variable. It doesn't deal primarily in the relationship between one variable like social support and another, BDI, scores on the BDI, so depression scores. Usually, it deals in terms of at least one-way, two-way interactions or more, meaning most science done now. I mean, if you went back and looked in the 50s and 60s, you might find more single variable studies, but very rarely today will you find any single variable studies because we're building on the work done before. So we have to find new boundary conditions, find situations in which those single relationships no longer apply, or when they're exacerbated, finding mechanisms for those relationships. So very rarely are you going to look for the relationship between one variable and one DV, all right? Even if that variable is categorical, meaning it has two conditions. One IV, if it's categorical, can have multiple conditions. And that's something that you want to make very clear in your head, because oftentimes people will say, you know, what the effect of this condition on this variable. No, we never look at the effect of some condition. We look at the effect of some variable. Now that variable might be reflected in the difference between a control condition and an experimental condition, but that's not looking at the effect of the condition, that's looking at the effect of the variable. But even still, one variable's effect on any DV is rarely of interest to us these days. So instead, we look for the effect of multiple variables. Now, for this class, we'll only look at the effect of two variables at a time, so that we can introduce you to the basic concept of an interaction. But first, let's do some simple review. All right. So again, up to this point, you've been just looking at the effects of some variable. So I've got two graphs here, two graphical representations of the relationship between a variable and an independent variable and a dependent variable. So here we have I've plotted in a line graph the relationship between number of negative life events and scores on the BDI. So as you can see, as number of negative life events increase, so does scores on the BDI, indicating greater depression. All right, that's a simple effect. All right, that's the simple effect of negative life events on depression, or scores on the BDI. Here we have a bar graph representing another effect. So here we have the effect of social exclusion compared to the effect of no exclusion on distress. So lo and behold, when you're socially excluded, you are more distressed than when you are not excluded. All right, both of these graphical representations are simply showing you the effect of one variable, one independent variable, on a dependent variable. And these are simply called effects. This would be the effect of negative life events on depression. This would be the effect of social exclusion on distress. But again, as I mentioned, the whole beginning of this video, very rarely are we interested in simply the effect of a single variable. Nowadays, we're interested in no less than the effect of two variables on a dependent variable and how those variables interact. All right, so let's take negative life events, for instance. Okay, so everybody has a different amount of negative life events that they encounter over the course of their life. And if it was a simple relationship between negative life events and depression, we would find that everybody who has a lot of crap in their life, they would all feel bad. And then all the people who don't have a whole lot of crap in their life, they don't feel that bad. But it's not that straightforward. There are many other variables pushing around that relationship between negative life events and BDI or depression. One of those is social support. So how much support, how much emotional support do you get from your friends, your loved ones? Those who have a lot of support from their friends and loved ones, from their careers, from their culture, from their government, all right? Those who have a lot of support tend to fare better in the face of negative life events than do those who have very little support. So here we have one variable, social support, changing the relationship between negative life events and depression. Here we have social support changing the effect that negative life events has on depression, on BDI scores. So if we were to plot that, we would get something like this. All right. So if I'm not sure how well you can read this in the video, but you have two lines here. And this is just like the graph I showed you before. All right. We have BDI scores on the y-axis, and we have negative life events on the x-axis with with a greater number of negative life events on this side. Now, you have a solid line representing all those individuals who have a lot of social support. So this dark solid line simply, I guess all the lines are dark, but the solid line represents those who have a lot of friends, or they have a lot of support from their friends, or a lot of support from their family, or from their culture, or from the government, or what have you. The dotted line represents those who don't have a lot of support. So they don't have many friends, or if they do, those friends are fairly superficial and they don't provide them a whole lot of emotional support. They have maybe no financial support. They don't have a lot in the way of support. So the dotted line represents those with very little support. If social support, first, in this graph, we see that for those who don't have much social support, as negative life events increase, so does their depression. So those who don't have a lot of social support, the more negative things they encounter in life, the worse they feel. However, if we look at the solid line, all right, representing those who have a lot of social support, notice that that line is flat. All right, so regardless of how many negative life events they have, all right, because they have high social support, their depression doesn't increase. So because they have this, something about this social support is changing the effect of negative life events. So for people who don't have a whole lot of social support, the more negative life events they have, the worse they feel. But for the people who have high social support, for some reason that's not the case. All right, they don't feel more depressed as they experience more negative things in life. Here we have social support, a second independent variable, affecting the way the other independent variable, negative life events, affects our DV, depression. High levels of social support basically gets rid of the relationship between negative life events and BDI scores. But low levels of social support allow that relationship to remain. Okay, so this is an interaction, also known as moderation. We have social support moderating, changing the relationship between negative life events and depression. Okay, well, let's go with the other example that I had, the effect of social exclusion on distress. So in one study by Baumeister and colleagues, they found that handling money actually offset the effects of social exclusion. So you remember the simple effect here? All right. Those who experience social exclusion tend to experience more distress than do those who don't experience exclusion. That's a fairly pervasive, fairly reliable effect. If you ever listen to some of the people who do some of that pioneering research, you can almost see the effect of the exclusion on their face as it's happening when using certain manipulations. Now, Baumeister found that he had half of his participants experience exclusion. He had the other half experience no exclusions. There's a basic paradigm for this that's beyond the scope of this video, so I won't go into it. But if you're interested, send me an email. I'll let you know. Or go look up the work of Baumeister. It's pretty cool. Williams is actually the one who came up with the particular manipulation most commonly used in exclusion research. Now, anyway, he found that, so again, half of the people were excluded, the other half were not. But then, half of both groups either counted money or counted paper. And then they measured distress after counting money or counting paper. What he found was this. So among the no exclusion conditions, the people who weren't excluded, there was no difference in distress, whether they counted paper or counted money. It didn't really matter. They didn't feel all that distressed. But here, all right, so those who were excluded, okay, but counted money, felt far less distressed than those who were excluded and counted paper. So here we have something about counting money offsetting the effect of social exclusion. So we know the basic effect, right, of social exclusion. Social exclusion makes people feel more distressed. But here, Baumeister and colleagues found that handling money changed the effect of social exclusion on distress. It reduced it. It made people not feel distressed. So if you compare the social exclusion condition that counted money with the no exclusion condition that counted money, there's no difference. All right. So if you look at the actual graph, there was a little bit of a difference, but it wasn't that big. While the difference between the exclusion and no exclusion conditions among people who counted paper, there was a significant difference. So those who were excluded and counted paper felt far more distressed than those who were not excluded and counted paper. So here again, we have a second independent variable, handling money, changing the relationship between another independent variable, social exclusion, and the DV, distress. So an interaction occurs. Again, another name for an interaction is moderation. An interaction occurs when a second variable, when one independent variable changes the effect of another independent variable on the DV. That's an interaction. Now, you also have heard the term main effect. And oftentimes what people do is they confuse a main effect with a basic effect. A basic effect, like these, don't account for other variables. It's just a simple effect. If you get into statistics, simple effect means something completely different. But it's just the basic effect of one IV on a DV. Okay? But when we start talking in terms of interactions, okay, if you were to find an effect of one DV on the effect of one IV on a DV by itself, regardless of the level of the other IV, that effect of one of those IVs in the context of a second IV is a main effect. So let's take this graph here, okay? Let's average across conditions here. Sorry. Bear with me, please. All right, so these two green bars here are the averages of the bars to the sides. Okay, so you see this bar with the circles in it, that is the average of these two, and this with the squiggles is the average of these two. Now you see this bar is bigger than this bar, so there's more distress in the social exclusion. there's more distress in the social exclusion condition than there is in the no exclusion condition. This is in the this is the effect of social exclusion even in the context of the counting money variable. So there's a difference between social exclusion and no social exclusion, even when accounting on average. So that's when accounting for whether they handled money or not. This is a main effect, because you still find a difference between the two conditions of one of your variables, social exclusion, even when considering the influence of your second independent variable. So social exclusion causes greater distress than no exclusion, even regardless of the effect of, even when accounting for the effect of whether they handled money or not. Now, here's the thing. You can have a main effect and an interaction together, or you can have main effects by themselves and no interaction. It's entirely possible for two variables to have no interaction. So let's see. So a good example isn't coming to mind right now, but it's entirely possible to have both an interaction and a main effect. But your job in the assignment 6, in the factorial design assignment, is to identify whether the description is a description of an interaction or a description of a main effect. Okay, so keep in mind, an interaction occurs when the effect of one variable changes depending on the levels of another. A main effect occurs when the effect of one variable does not change depending upon the levels of the other. Okay, so that is the difference between a main effect and an interaction. You can have interactions and main effects together at the same time. That is possible. All right, but you can have main effects by themselves without interactions. Okay. Now, you'll notice that I used both line graphs and bar graphs. And so just as a quick aside, quick final comment, students often get confused by that. The custom that I have been taught is that whether you use a bar graph or a line graph depends on the nature of your variables. If your variables are continuous, so here, all your DVs, unless you're doing something like a logistic regression, which you're not trained in yet, usually DVs in maybe the majority of research, DVs are always continuous. Certainly in all the statistical analyses that you are trained in the stats class. Here, they're all continuous DVs. But your IV is what matters. If your IV is continuous, like negative life events is, all right, you can have no negative life events, or you can have a lot. Then there's a continual transition between 0 and there's really no top end. That's continuous. If your IV is continuous, usually you want to represent your effects graphically using a line graph. If your IV is categorical, like it is here, all right? So if you're using an experimental design, then, so here you're either in the social exclusion condition or you're not. That's not continuous, that's categorical. So when your IV is categorical, so it could be dichotomous, you could have more than one, you could have 2 or more conditions, you could have 3 conditions, 4 conditions. When your IV is categorical, you want to use a bar graph. When your IV is continuous, you want to use line. All right, guys, that is all I have for this video. If you have any questions, please send them my way. But that is it. So I will catch you all later on.